This optional screencast explains how RSpec takes advantage of Ruby's dynamic language features and open classes to make your test code a lot more readable. So how is it that we're able to write in our spec tests things like current year from days should equal 1970? What's going on there? Well, if I fire up the interactive Ruby interpreter, and I'm going to manually load RSpec, which is something that is done for you automatically when you run spec from the command line, one of the effects of loading RSpec is that the should method, which we're using in our test case, gets mixed into the class object, which is the root class from which all other classes inherit. That means that every object is now able to respond to should, and an interesting question is, what happens when we call it? You can see that it actually returns a new kind of object, which is a matching object configured against matching the value 5, which was the value of its receiver. And in typical Ruby fashion, why don't we assign this to a temporary intermediate? We'll call it matcher. The next step is to remember that when we write something in Ruby like this, what we're really doing is taking advantage of syntactic sugar provided by the language. Remember that everything is a method call, and every method call has to have a receiver. So, in fact, what this really is doing is calling the equals method on the integer 5 and passing the integer 7 as an argument to that method. That's the key to understanding why we can write something like this. What's actually going on is that we're calling the equals method on the object returned by should, and we're passing an argument to it. But of course, in Ruby, parentheses are often optional for a method call, so that works just as well. And if we take the object that we captured by calling should, we can see that the same thing works. We can actually take this a step further and include some nice syntactic sugar that RSpec comes with. Again, this is loaded for you automatically when you're running specs from the command line. This mixes in a number of methods to object that allow us to set up comparisons for our tests. For example, we can set up a comparison of something being less than a constant, less than 7. This is a comparison object, and now we can pass this object to should. So in an analogous way that should sets up a matcher that's pre-configured to match a specific value, B sets up an object that can be compared to an expected value in the same way. And again, if we unpack this whole thing, I'm just writing out the method call and expanding the comparison variable in place, and we can remember that, again, this is really taking advantage of syntactic sugar. If we were to write that instead, this is interpreted as calling the less than method on the B object. And once again, if we take out the optional parentheses, as Ruby allows us to do, we're left with a really nice way of expressing an expectation. In fact, we can go even further than that. I'm going to define a very simple method here that tells us if a number is a perfect square. Basically, you can see that it just takes the square root of the number and checks whether we get the same value when we truncate it to an integer. And we can, in fact, verify that 4 is a perfect square, and 5 is not. And now, using a similar RSpec trick, we are able to write for should pretty nice, and even nicer if we omit the parentheses. So what's going on here? This is an example of using Ruby's dynamic feature of method missing. When RSpec realizes that there is no method called be a perfect square, it next looks for whether a method called just perfect square is defined on the receiver object that was returned by should. The question mark is optional, and the A is optional. So in fact, writing this would be just as good. And in fact, if we try it with a number that fails the test, as expected, we get an expectation not met error. This would have caused our test to fail. So that's how RSpec uses Ruby features like method missing and syntactic sugar to make your test code among the most readable on Earth.